All right, we are
Yes.
live. We're messing around right now with the cameras, but I have Kurt Hackbarth and Jose Luis Granados Ceja from the Soberanía podcast and Mexico Solidarity Media. Thank you, those of you who are joining right now. I'm sorry, I know some of you were in the other room and we were just having all the technical fun that comes with this because I don't know. Ever since COVID days, that's been a traumatic experience for all of us. Um, but we are gathered here today to not talk about what's going on with the shutdown because I can't right now. And instead, we're going to talk about something probably arguably worse, which is, well, two different subjects that we want to get into today. We have on the docket talking about what is going on in Venezuela, around Venezuela, what the U.S. is doing to Venezuela, and not just Venezuela, actually, several other Latin American countries as well. What that certainly means for the geopolitical situation in the Caribbean, in Latin America, what that could mean for things like Mexican sovereignty. And then we also want to get into the judicial injunction question in Mexico. And for the US viewers, it does not mean what you think it is, or not exactly. Our idea of an injunction is similar but different, and so we'll talk about those things. But I want to, with the judicial reform that was kind of reached its completion with the elections. Um, I want Kurt in particular, but certainly both of you, to chat about what this means for what you're seeing like on the horizon for Mexico moving forward. Because I think it's fascinating. And as we contemplate our own judicial system over here, mostly a top court that will not be named at this time, things that we can take away from y'all's experience. Because I am a great admirer of the judicial reform, much as the right wing bots in my comments would have me believe that it is the end of all federal republics and democracy as we know it. So, anyway, with all of that being said, could you guys tell us what is going on in Venezuela in particular? Maybe in light of the fact that we just awarded a Nobel Peace Prize to a person from Venezuela who is, pro-democracy, right? Is like, definitely right, all of that. So anyway, however you guys want to start this conversation, I leave it up to you.
Sure. You want me to go start?
Yeah.
All right. So just to jump in on this one, I think one of the key things to say, especially when we're dealing with this administration in the United States, is that I think it would be a mistake, as you well said in your introduction, to view this as just about Venezuela. And one of the things I've always been saying is that this is a war on all of Latin America. And when it first started, you have to remember these extrajudicial killings out of call things what they actually are. This is what not only a panel of UN experts, but also the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, also said about these attacks. These are extrajudicial executions. They have no basis in international law. They certainly are in violation of international humanitarian law and human rights. And I think we saw them start in September. The fact that they happened on the day that Marco Rubio arrived to Mexico, I think in a lot of ways is telling. That for me was the first sign that this isn't just about Venezuela and this isn't just about regime change or trying to oust Maduro, but sending a message to the region. It was no coincidence that it happened on this day. And I think when we see at the beginning, it was just the Caribbean. It was mostly in that area, actually, quite specifically. And there's this tiny little strip of water between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. Most of those early strikes happened there. And as the information has come out, it turns out that many of them, there's a very interesting investigation by the Associated Press, which actually went to these communities and talked to them. And it turns out that many of them are just down on their luck people who are trying to eke out a living, finding a way to survive. Yes, some of them were involved with drug running and the rest of it, but these aren't, big name drug traffickers. These aren't narco terrorists as they've been trying to sell us. And so then we saw it expand into the Pacific and over to off the coast of Colombia. And there you have it, right? The precisely what we had been warning about, that this isn't just about Venezuela, this is entirely about the entire region. We see expanded there. And even now we see it moving northwards. One of the more recent attacks, I believe it was 2 or 3 attacks ago, happened just off the coast of Acapulco, Guerrero, Mexico. So we're talking about a little bit further north in the Pacific. The reason we know it happens there is because it turns out in one of these strikes, they identified that somebody had survived. And the closest Coast Guard search and rescue that had the capability of actually responding, it turns out, was Mexico. So Mexico sent out a boat and a plane. Unfortunately, that survivor actually was never found. So it gives you an idea that this is the entire region and this is what we were warning about. And I think the key thing for me to communicate here, which is asking ourselves why. Why would the United States change its strategy? Why they're pursuing this? And I think there's like a domestic consideration. I think a lot of this is being driven by Marco Rubio, above all, the Secretary of State, who's always taken a very hardline position when it comes to the left-wing governments in the region. But in particular, he has almost a personal vendetta against the governments of Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And so he's very much been driving this agenda. Again, there's been some interesting reporting around this. I believe it was Politico who ended up writing a story about how he managed to convince Trump to join in on his campaign to put this kind of military pressure on Maduro above all, by kind of convincing him that this was about drugs. It's not about drugs. And I think that's something that we should mention as well, right? Most of these boats, even if we accept that they are smuggling drugs, obviously, when you blow them up out of the water, there's no evidence left behind. But let's take them at their word. These are drug smuggling boats. They're not headed for the United States. It's too far of a distance to go from Venezuela all the way to, Florida, which would probably be the closest place, right? And they would have to refuel if that was really the intention. These are mostly within the Caribbean itself or into Central America if we're talking about the Pacific coast. And so these aren't drugs that are, as they tried to sell us, destined for the United States, that are going to kill people. I mean, that's their entire legal justification for everything that they're doing. That part is just absolutely not true. But it is putting a lot of pressure on the Maduro government in Venezuela. They've obviously had to respond to this. I think their idea was to kind of create a fissure within the leadership of Venezuela, the armed forces, but also the political leadership, in hopes of prompting a coup. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And it didn't happen when they tried it in Trump's first term. It's not happening now. And so now they're kind of stuck in this position of trying to, l- treat as legitimate their strategy of bombing indiscriminately, of engaging in extrajudicial executions. We saw them pull back a little bit. And I think that's quite interesting, again, to go back to the domestic situation in the United States. I think that's due to the fact that they were honestly scared that there was going to be a vote to stop this in the Senate using the War Powers Resolution. They were very, very close. It was a razor-thin margin that ended up being rejected. And I think it largely got rejected because they held a briefing shortly before that vote. I believe it was the night before, where they accepted that they don't have the legal justification for strikes on land against Venezuela. That their justification, which again is already a stretch, is based off of them striking in international water, and their legal office has not developed an opinion that allows them to be able to go and say what we're doing is legal. It obviously isn't, as we identified before. So I think a lot of this is about trying to make up the strategy as they go along, in terms of trying to figure out how individual actors like Marco Rubio, Stephen Miller, and these can actually advance their own, I would say, almost individual agendas. And then there's kind of the geopolitical things, and this will be my final comment on this. I think the United States has accepted that it can't win this rivalry with China. They're very much kind of in a very competitive position. And by accepting the fact that they can no longer really dispute the fight for global hegemony, we're very much kind of moving into a new world where there's multipolarity, where there are several kind of superpowers, a bit like the Cold War, but with obviously very different dynamics. What they're doing, and this is my hypothesis, is that they're retreating into their traditional spheres of influence. And the United States, as much as I detest the phrase, views Latin America as its backyard. It views it as its natural place. And we even seen Sebastian Gorka, for example, invoking the Monroe Doctrine once again, as saying that, no, we can basically interfere in the region all we want. And the reason, I think, is, on one hand, there are a lot of important markets for the United States and its products here in this hemisphere. They've lost a lot of market share to China and its exports and its strategies in the region. And so they want to regain that market, but they also want access to cheap resources and cheap labor. And so it's a kind of about disciplining, conditioning all of the region, which is why I always emphasize this isn't just about Venezuela. It's not just about Colombia, which is also in the crosshairs right now. It's about the entire region. What's at risk for Latin America if the United States is able to proceed in this way and to act with impunity, to violate international law. I mean, obviously, international law has taken quite a beating over the last few years. And so it's very difficult to kind of use it to the defense of the interests of the human rights of the populations of Latin America. And so I think that's why we have to see an important pushback against this, and not just from the countries that are in the crosshairs, but the countries that could be in the near future. Or, and to this, I'm speaking to kind of like the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the President of Ecuador, the President of El Salvador, all of these regional leaders who think that by playing nice with the United States, that things are going to work out for them. And history has told us that's not the case whatsoever.
No, that's not how that
It's very,
works.
very dangerous.
Right. Yeah, you touched on so many things. I know you guys talked a lot about like the CELAC situation, and CELAC is could you list out the whole acronym for our audience for those who are not familiar?
Yeah. SALAC is a community of Latin American and Caribbean states. It's kind of was created as an alternative to the OAS, the Organization of American States, where all the countries almost, there's a few, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua are not members, is a space that used to be called the U.S. Ministry of Colonies. And it was very much that same kind of thinking that this region is here to serve the interests of U.S. imperialism. Obviously, we reject that notion. But the OAS, and I think particularly under the leadership of Luis Almagro, who's no longer Secretary General, kind of played a very interventionist role, a very disruptive role, and not really promoting peace and development in the region, but very much promoting U.S. interests. But SALAC was created basically as an alternative. And it includes everybody in the region except Canada and the United States,
Mhm.
precisely because the relations are different with countries that are rich and powerful and try to exert their influence over our region. And so SALAC has a rotating presidency, and the current one is being held by Colombia. So it's held by the president of the country that holds the presidency of the organization. And they recently just concluded a summit in Santa Marta, Colombia, that was together with the European Union. And so a lot of it is commercial. A lot of this is about kind of developing commercial ties. Europe is obviously interested in as well in diversifying its markets as a result of kind of these differences with this White House administration. But it did mention some of this, and I think that's important. They didn't explicitly talk about these bombings, but they did say that drug interdiction, attempts at reducing, the ingress of narcotics and the rest of it has to abide by international law. So it's kind of, saying it without saying it directly, which is still, I think, important, because the more that we can get people to actually really, in no uncertain terms, state clearly that what the United States is doing is illegal and must be stopped, the better, because otherwise we may see, and this can kind of shift the conversation to Mexico. We know that Trump and many people in his government have the intention, the desire of bombing Mexican territory. And obviously, the situation with Mexico is very different. They can't do what they can do in the Caribbean here for a lot of reasons we can get into if you're interested, mainly because of the close relationship. But they want to, and they want to lay the groundwork for it. And so the
Yeah,
more we can say no to this, the better.
Yeah, I'd like
right.
to just jump in on this a little bit. Just a few things. I agree with Jose Luis's analysis about the U.S. empire is kind of folding back in, right? In this idea
Right,
of at least temporarily to regroup. I don't think the United States' global aspirations will ever fully be quenched with this 800 plus military bases and special forces all over the place, right? It's a strategic retreat and retrenchment. So you see the U.S. Playing nice with China now, right? And
right,
Trump even meeting with Xi Jinping and backpedaling on the tariffs. And now China's at least symbolically restricting exports of precursor agents for fentanyl. And, they're playing nice for now, right? You see the U.S. trying to offload basically the Ukraine situation on Europe, requiring NATO countries to pay, spend 5% of their GDP now in defense, basically so the U.S. can kind of try to back out of that. Um, so what you unfortunately see because of that, unfortunately in the Latin American sense, is a renewed, of the sense of the United States placing its eyes on Latin America, right?
right.
There was actually a great time in Latin America when the United States was distracted with the Middle East in the early 2000s under Bush, and that led to the Marea Rosa, the pink tide governments of South America, right? That could really
Mhm.
develop not only domestic progressive governments, but also the first moves towards cooperation across the Southern Cone. Now we're in a situation where, it's almost like 20 years ago again, when the United States was trying to impose ALCA, the free trade, a zone of the Americas all across, right? And that led to the famous rallying cry of ALCA al carajo, which is, in Spanish, kind of shove your ALCA, right?
Anniversary, which just happened.
That anniversary just happened. So I'm kind of saying all of this because when the United States folds back into what it considers its natural territory, it then applies practices that it used to use kind of safely far away, much closer to home. And I'm talking about specifically the drone war. And that was Obama's drone war. And that was, in Yemen, and they were bombing weddings, and they were even bombing U.S. citizens. And, this is on us, too, as U.S. citizens. There wasn't enough of an outcry then against the drone war. And when there isn't, that thing always mutates and always, it always expands and mutates, just like everything in the military industrial complex. And now they're applying that to the Caribbean, and they're applying it to the Pacific. And they would like to apply it, as Jose Luis said, on land, right?
Right.
In countries that the United States would like to target. Now, will they do it is the big question, right? There was already reports that the DEA in the early months of Trump, too, was trying to push the Trump administration, goad the Trump administration into drone bombing Mexico. And actually, it was the Pentagon, bizarrely, that was the voice of reason on that. And then recently we saw another piece that's saying that the Trump administration is in the early stages of planning to bomb Mexico. Right? Now, we have to take these pieces with a grain of salt always, because they always use unnamed sources, and they always use, this source said, that source said. And these pieces could well be a way of trying to goad the Trump administration into doing something, right? Like the Miami Herald piece of a couple of weeks ago that said the Trump administration is ready to attack Venezuela. And even Trump and Rubio came out and said, no, that's not true.
No, right. Yeah, they were like,
so there's a way of, they're trying to use these leaks to try to push the Trump administration into taking that last suicidal step.
Right.
For the moment, within the absolute craziness and dangerousness of the moment, there has been at least an iota of reason that has prevented them from taking that last step. And it's not because they're good people. It's because I think they've clearly realized that an invasion of Venezuela would be a disaster. It would be a disaster for them. They've already tried it. They've already tried to coup Venezuela in 2002. They always tried to coup Venezuela, and Trump won. It never worked. It would be another Vietnam. So I think the Trump administration is conveniently using the threat of the War Powers Resolution to say, oh, we don't have authority.
Right.
Do you think if Trump thought they could win in Venezuela, they would be stopped by the War Powers Resolution? I think they absolutely would not. They would do it.
Right.
They're using it now as a convenient break. Oh, well, we don't have authority, as if they cared.
Right.
But fine, if they want to use that as their out, they can use that as
We
their
are
out
happy
for
to
now.
let them use that. Right. Yeah, I would love for you guys to talk a little bit about how this is not the first time we have done this. You mentioned like this coup attempt is not new. And I was young at this time, but I even remember like, oh, Hugo Chavez is a dictator, and like Venezuela, that's the water that we swam in as citizens of the U.S. And certainly if you're like a kid, it was just like I remember like in civics and government classes, and like that's what we were taught. I would love to hear from you, like what especially Jose Luis, Venezuela is one of your areas of expertise. Like what is this like? What is the balance to take here? I guess as opposed to what we're usually given as citizens of the U.S., which is just Venezuela is a communist dictatorship or whatever, like insert thing here. And that's why we have to, for the sake of protecting, democracy. And if you want to get into, again, our newest Nobel Peace Laureate, who just dedicated her prize to Trump, which is very eye roll worthy. But like, yeah, please, if you would talk about that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about elections in Venezuela, It's interesting because people throw the phrase free and fair. The elections weren't free and fair. And I'm going to say something that maybe will be surprising. I agree they weren't free and fair, but not for the reasons that the US State Department claims. Venezuela is being strangled economically by the United States, full stop. And it does it through the dominance of the US dollar. So the US dollar is so important because it is the currency that's used to sell oil in international markets. And obviously, they can use certain instruments to prevent countries like Venezuela from being able to openly sell oil. And it is a very much an oil economy. They've obviously diversified and they've kind of, tried to move away from it, but it's the country with the largest proven reserves on this planet. Not even Saudi Arabia has as much oil as Venezuela does. And so by making it difficult for them to sell it, they obviously punish the country. Can you imagine, trying to compete in an election when there is another foreign party that is strangling your economy? And that's actually one of the things that never enters the conversation around, these allegations of, undemocratic maneuvers and, marginalization of the opposition and the rest of it. We have to pay attention to that part. And that is very much U.S. policy. It's U.S. policy that's creating the situation. Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez was in power, for example, and oil prices were really high, was able to take that oil wealth that the country clearly has and redistribute it through social programs, through housing, through, for example, on the issue of housing, to date, there's been over 5 million units of social housing built over basically the last 10 years. So just like a monumental investment in that. They created really innovative health programs called Barrio Adentro, where first, Cuban doctors, because Venezuelan doctors didn't want to work in the poor neighborhoods, would go and work, literally live and work inside of these communities that had never had access to healthcare before. And then obviously they trained Venezuelan doctors, and now it's mostly Venezuelan doctors that do that. Just all kinds of different kinds of social programs. The idea was that this oil wealth, which had never really made it to the working class, to the campesinos, to the poor, to the most marginalized of Venezuela, could finally see some of that. And that's why you saw extraordinary amounts of support for Hugo Chavez and for a moment there, Nicolas Maduro. Obviously, the situation has changed dramatically since then. And as I've mentioned, it's very difficult to try to run an economy when you're facing unilateral coercive measures by the United States. Nonetheless, they've been really kind of creative and inventive about this. And I think another thing is also, let's talk about the Venezuelan opposition. A lot of times it's kind of painted as homogeneous. And the truth is that there are very different kinds. There's some that obviously play by the rules of the game and compete in elections and try to win power and convince the population and the rest of it. Maria Corina Machado and her kind of inner circle represent the extreme right, the most hardline positions. They very much disagree with trying to achieve power through elections. They tried to compete in this last one. I'll get into the kind of the details of the most recent election, but what happens is so they pursued, for example, the support for the coup in 2002 that Kurt mentioned. Maria Corina Machado was among the signatories of the document that tried to dissolve the state. Quite literally, from one day to another, they tried to, everybody who had been elected to office was removed. The Supreme Court was suspended. The Congress was suspended. The name of the country was restored to its previous name, all this kinds of stuff. She claims it was just an attendance list, but everybody knows what it was. It was a list to try to give legitimacy to this coup government. Obviously, the population mobilized, and they were able to go and rescue Hugo Chavez and bring him back and restore constitutional order to Venezuela. But that's just an example of the kind of thinking that they operate under. She was also a big supporter of the insurrectionary strategy. Let's promote an insurrection to try to oust the government. It happened twice in 2014 and 2017. Obviously, neither of those were successful, but that was the strategy, to try to create an insurrection, to create so much destabilization within the country that the government essentially collapses and that they would be able to kind of assume power. Now, finally, on this question of the most recent election, I think it's really quite suspect that only the institutions, the sovereign institutions of states like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, are come into question. There were very, very serious allegations of fraudulent results in Ecuador, in El Salvador, but we don't hear the same narrative that we hear when it comes to Venezuela. And that's because these countries are aligned with U.S. interests, and therefore you don't see them amplified in mainstream media and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
And then
especially El
finally,
Salvador.
Exactly. I mean, it's quite
Yeah,
likely he won the election. He's a very popular figure. I'm not trying to say
right.
he isn't, but there were some very, very dubious results and accounting of the congressional election, and he had to get
Yes,
that to have the supermajority to do everything that he wants to do. But you never hear Bukele called a dictator by MSNBC, if any, and CNN, all the rest of it. Only Maduro, only these countries that are obviously in the crosshairs of Washington. And so the final thing I would say is that the Venezuelan opposition has cried fraud in every single election it didn't win. Every single one. There's been more than 20 electoral processes since 1999, since Hugo Chavez was first elected, and then the beginning of what they call the Bolivarian Revolution there. In every single one except two, which they won, they have cried fraud. And so,
right,
it's the boy who cried wolf. Do you now
right.
I'm expected to believe you now that you claim that you have, proof that there was a fraudulent result when you've been crying fraud the whole time? It makes it, for me, as a close follower of Venezuela, very difficult to believe. And also, I think there is a question of sovereignty. It's not up to us to question the institutions. It went through a very rigorous process. Their own electoral authority, the Supreme Court got involved, and they made the declaration. If this was any other country, they would accept it. Be like, okay, well, Venezuela's, this is the result of the action. But Mariana Corina Machado, and finally, this will be my last thing. I know sometimes I go on for too long.
No, you're
Uh,
fine.
Her winning the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, is really telling. It's clearly an effort to try to elevate her so that she would be kind of the natural successor if a coup was successful, if they were able to even assassinate Maduro, right? She's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She's obviously the person who should rise to power. She's actually a pretty marginal figure in the opposition. She was almost ridiculed by even her own fellow conservative opposition supporters. Her profile obviously has grown greatly over the last few years, but that mostly has to do with the fact that Juan Guaido, who the US decided was the legitimate president of Venezuela at one point, he did a colossally terrible job and really kind of harmed his group or his part of the opposition in terms of their support. And she was able to kind of fill that gap. And that's why she has a
Mhm.
much larger kind of presence in Venezuelan politics today. But she's a reactionary. She's a far right reactionary. She sent a letter to Benjamin Netanyahu asking for his government support is in order to quote unquote restore democracy in Venezuela. I mean, you're asking somebody who shortly later, this was before the genocide, but and then ultimately committed a genocide against the Palestinian people. This is the kind of person that she is, someone who is not doesn't really have democratic credentials, uh, isn't the fierce defender, but in fact, actually, she's even gone on a media tour and talking about everything she would do if they, ousted Maduro and everything she promised, free markets, opening up to foreign investments, all the rest of this kind of stuff, obviously favors U.S. capital, but also is in violation of the Venezuelan constitution. So everything she's promising would go against this. So there's not really, she doesn't have a democratic bone in her body, I would say.
I think that's very valid. And I think it's very telling. We are never told, again, we being like the US, right? The general citizenry. Before, I think you guys were talking about it a couple episodes ago on your podcast. That whole Hugo Chavez being rescued by the people thing, that's never in the narrative. All we hear is that there was a coup, and he was ousted, and blah blah blah, and not that the people were like, no, thank you. And, and went to go get him, which is telling, right? If there's all this electoral fraud, if it's really not about, the will of the people and whatnot, then why, when they were supposedly rescued from their oppressor or whatever, did they kind of rise up as one to do that? And I just found that fascinating, in y'all's analysis of this. I was just like, w yeah, I know why we never hear it. I'm not confused about, like, the storytelling that happens in our country. I just it's just, like, enraging really like, can we just, like first of all, I usually from the US, I'm like, "Can we just leave people alone? Can we just, like, mind our own business?" Every once in a
Starting there,
while, like,
just starting there, yeah.
that would
That
be
would be
great.
great.
Like, we have so many, like, things we need to deal. It's so funny because it's always like, "America first, America first." I'm like, "That would be great, actually." I would love an America First party, where we stop poking at every other country, whether it's China or Mexico or Canada or Iran or what, like, just leave them alone. for the love of God. So I really, I'm definitely running out of patience for it. And as I um, kind of complain privately to people, this is like a both wings of the same bird issue. I know people hate it when I say that, but I'm like, Democrats and Republicans are equally guilty of this interventionist policy. They do
especially
not.
when it comes to Venezuela, right?
Yeah,
It was
right,
Obama who actually started the sanctions campaign against
right.
Venezuela. It was
Yes,
it's his decree from 2015 that gets renewed every year by every president. And we've had
yep,
Democrats and Republicans since
right,
to establish that Venezuela is an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. I wanted to say one tiny thing about the people rescuing, because I think the fact that this is left out also leads to errors in analysis today. There is an overconfidence about the power of the US military. They think that just by showing up on your shores, they'll scare you enough that you'll do what they want you to do. Obviously, it didn't work. That's why they're sending the world's largest aircraft carrier to the Caribbean as well to further intimidate.
which
But
is now not going.
it's sort of maybe going, not going, like it was like they're playing games.
Yeah.
But,
right. Yeah.
you know, we talk about the rescue of Hugo Chavez. That was the birth of what they call the civic military union. So that obviously the armed forces acted because they saw millions of people demanding that for them to act, to go and rescue our president. And they went, and the loyal forces went, and the helicopter grabbed him and brought him back to the presidential palace.
Hmm.
And that civil military union is still active today. If you look at alternative media sources like Venezuela Analysis, where I write, you will see coverage of the militia. These are ordinary Venezuelan citizens who, seeing the very real threat of a U.S. invasion potentially of their land, people have to understand how much people want to defend their territory, their land. This is where our ancestors are buried, right? Like we're not going to allow foreign boots to just stroll their way in here. They've been joining and training. You'll see 80-year-old grandmas in military fatigues learning how to best contribute to the defense of the homeland. And this is happening everywhere throughout Venezuela. The militia was created, if I'm not mistaken, in 2009, but it's become much greater in terms of it actually forms part of their defense strategy in the face of a potential U.S. invasion. And that shows the enthusiasm that does exist within the population. It's not as high as it was during the years of Hugo Chavez, of course, but there's, of course, a population that still very much believes in the project that is represented by the United Socialist Party, the Bolivarian Revolution, and are very much active in it. And I think the best example of that, a lot of people never hear about this, are the communes of Venezuela. There are actual communes in Venezuela where the people who live and work in the territory own and control the means of production and decide democratically how to administer it and how to administer the profits. It's incredible. There's this example of one in Caracas where during the worst of the pandemic, what they would do is actually anybody who was able to get medicines from their family sent to them directly, they would collectivize it and then democratically decide who needed that medicine most, right? Is there to kind of almost like a triage, but community based. They built, these kinds of agricultural products to be able to sell in the market and generate revenue. There's some really exciting things. For me anyway, the deepest, most profound actual democracy we've probably seen in the 21st century, of actually people really having genuine control over how things are decided inside of their own communities and their own territory. But that part never comes up. It's always Maduro's
Right.
dictator.
Right.
Just a
Well,
couple of
and
quick
I
points on that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think even if that part did come up, like I can hear, as you were describing it, I can already hear it. Of like, like the commune thing is like, oh, we're going to democratically decide who gets medicine. Okay, but like, let's be so for real right now. In the United States, first of all, the genesis of the United States was exactly this type of militia Minutemen thing. So let's not act like we're, some sort of, you know, I, if anyone's complaining, I can hear the voices right now in my head that would complain about that, and I would just say, well, I'm not quite sure how we split from Britain instead, so let's just not go down that road. But also, when it's very easy for us from the U.S. to be like, why would we need to collectively like get resources together and figure it out? Okay, well, when we're the economic superpower who hoards everything and our currency is the reserve. You were just talking about the economic warfare that we unleash on not just Venezuela, but like literally everyone. Um, it's ridiculous that we then turn around and are questioning the methods by which these communities, to which scarcity is a real thing all the time, are then like, okay, well, the best, like, let's come up with the best system we can with the resources that we have to make sure that our people are taken care of. And we're gonna like sneer at it and call it socialism and communism and like and do whatever. And I find that like I get so, you guys talk often, very often about how we have the US's foreign policy is so contraindicative. Like, we want to cut off the economy at the knees. And then why are all these people coming to our borders? And then why, like it's just, and I just, it's so frustrating to me. And then, like I said, I just, as you were describing the situation in Venezuela, and I love the way you frame it, but I can literally hear even like, centrist Democrats and whatever who would be like, like immediately uproar about that sort of system. And it's like, well, what do you want the people to do? Like, they don't have unlimited, you know, uh, COVID medicine. So what exactly is supposed to happen here? Because the alternative is that somebody just like, is like the death warrant and decides who does what and where, or it could be a collective situation. And I feel like usually the collective thing is better. Anyway, that's just my little rant about that because I get real mad when we want to complain about one thing, but it's like literally we are creating the problem. Usually, we are creating either the artificial scarcity because it is artificial. We have plenty of everything. There is literally no reason for this. The U.S. is one of the is the agent of artificial scarcity as far as I'm concerned. And I know there's other powers who definitely contribute, but let's not pretend that it's not the U.S. leading the charge on that. Anyway, sorry, this is your interview, but
Absolutely right. And
yeah.
the only um, perverse virtue of Trump is that he says the quiet part out loud. So that's a pedagogical moment for people. Trump very specifically said, if I had, won re-election in 2020 and his whole fraud allegations, whatever else, we would have invaded Venezuela, we would have gotten the oil. So he's telling you,
Right.
it's about the oil. It's about
Yeah.
the oil, right?
Yes.
So don't let any other corporate media hack try to, spin all kinds of stories about other,
About how it's
supposed
about
rationales.
democracy.
It's about the oil.
Right.
Trump said about Syria, we occupied a third of Syria for the oil. For
Right.
the oil.
That is like obviously I despise Trump. Always have, always will. From his apprentice days, I remember being like, this guy is like so annoying. But anyway, now I wish for those days. How quaint. But one thing about him is that at least he is just saying with his mouth like what the intelligence community, the armed forces, whatever, what they will not say. They will like spin all these fairy tales about how it's about we're establishing democracy or we're like, they wanted us there, right? The people wanted us there to rescue them from, um,
They
whatever.
will welcome us as liberators. That was the
Right.
great
We are
Atlantic book.
right.
Remember that one?
Yes. Yes.
Remember how that turned
Exactly.
out?
It turned out great. And
Yeah.
that's just again, that goes back to the point of like I am so tired of this foreign policy that's like, we created this problem and now we're complaining about the solution. And we usually created the problem because of oil or money or something. It comes back to oil a lot. Um, I or something else. Like I was in some kind of private conversation, people send me DMs and whatnot, and complaining about how I was criticizing Israel. And I was like, we literally created that problem. Like we created that problem. And now we're going to be mad that it's I was like, we not only created like the problem itself, the states, the fact that it's not two states, the whole thing, like we created that. But also like Netanyahu's our creature. Like he is the creature of the US and like and the creation of the US. And like it's just anyway, I could go on forever.
And that's the
Lots of
obscenity about the returning to the Nobel Peace Prize, because it's yoking the Nobel Peace Prize not only to coup designs in Venezuela, but to a genocide in the Middle East in
exactly.
one fell swoop. In one fell swoop. Right?
Right.
You'd have to
I
go
went
back to maybe getting it
running.
to Kissinger after bombing Laos and Cambodia to get about as bad, arguably worse,
Right.
bestowal.
I went running to y'all's channels as soon as that Nobel Peace Prize was announced. I was like, I cannot wait to see what we start saying about this. I actually told my husband, I was like, the Soberanía podcast comes out like tomorrow, whatever day it was, and I cannot wait to listen to this because I know they're going to talk about this woman, and I didn't know anything about her, so I was truly like, it was more out of curiosity, but I had like a feeling about it. I was like, I have a feeling that this is they're going to have very different takes from the AP, for instance. You guys did not disappoint. I would love, if you're ready, I would love to move on to, you know, the judicial injunction question. And again, in the U.S., we hear the word judicial injunction, and quite frankly, for us, that's kind of a good thing most of the time these days. Um, and in the U.S., a judicial injunction is obviously a judge is putting, usually temporary, as temporary can be very interesting sequence of time depending on what we're talking about, but a temporary stay on some kind of ruling that or some kind of action, right? So like the most, ridiculous one I remember was Biden put out student debt relief. A judge put like a year's worth of a stay on it. And then the Supreme Court made up their major questions doctrine to, eventually get rid of it. And that's a whole other topic. In Mexico, what is the injunction? And I know there's an actual like Spanish term for this that I'm not going to attempt to say, but like if you will explain like what that means in Mexico, what it is, and how you see the judicial reform interacting with that practice. So please take it away.
Sure. So just to really finish up very quickly on the previous point, also watch the U.S. military because it's not totally united behind Trump's misadventures in the Caribbean and
No,
the
it's
Pacific. Alvin
no,
Hosley, the head of Southcom, resigned
yeah,
very clearly in disagreement over the bombings of those boats. He had only been in that position for 11 months. We saw a colonel from the Marines, Doug Krugman, resign because of disagreement over Trump's policy, and actually penned an op-ed in the Washington Post about it. We saw, general discontent over Hegseth's bizarre meeting with the generals, right? So, watch it because the analysis that the U.S. military, the U.S. Armed Forces is a monolith is also not the case. There are some sane voices there that are very upset with what's going on, just to put that
yeah.
out as
Well,
well.
and I'm in the area where that carrier is supposed to
Mhm.
go out. So I'm in a big military area, and that carrier is from here. And yeah,
So
it's
you're
not
not
a
a
united
negative
front,
there, right?
not at all. No.
With regards to, it's called the amparo in Spanish. The amparo is very interesting. It's actually Mexico's, what we say, it's Mexico's contribution to international jurisprudence in the sense of this figure of the amparo developed in Mexico in the 19th century. Um, it doesn't have an exact translation into English. The closest, as you said, is injunction. And it has the idea of an injunction in the idea of stopping something, right? Stopping something harmful. So that is a big part of the amparo, but it's not the only part. There's also overlap in the Anglo-Saxon system with habeas corpus. This idea of there has to be, a reason. There can't be arbitrary, detentions of people, except if you're ICE, right? Um, and also the idea of constitutional review that exists in some countries, right? Where you can appeal to a court to see if a certain measure is constitutionally right. Um, Constitutionally valid without waiting for it to go through all the hoops of seeing, of judging its constitutionality because it's something urgent. That's the idea of the amparo, right? That there is an urgent situation happening. There's an abuse of power that is happening or is about to happen, either by commission or omission. So we have to act now. The courts have to step in now. That's really the idea of the amparo, is to stop an abuse against an individual, right?
Correct.
That's the idea in general. Now, over time, the problem with that, as happens with so many things in law and elsewhere, is the original sense of that has gotten perverted. And it's become a way for wealthy people to have basically a get out of jail free card, right? As if the legal system were a game of Monopoly, right? Because the amparo is an appeal to a federal court. It's an appeal to a federal court against an abuse again at the state and local or also federal level. So it's not something that anybody can avail themselves of. You have to have a good lawyer. It's a process. So what we saw, fast forwarding from its origins in the 19th century to the López Obrador government was a concerted campaign to use the amparo as part of a lawfare strategy to attack each and every project of the López Obrador government and to try to gum it up and to try to stop it in its tracks. And that was most openly manifested in the big ticket infrastructure projects, like the new airport in Mexico City, the AIFA, which I think had, if I remember correctly, something like 140 amparos thrown at it. The Maya train project, the refinery at Dos Bocas, in the idea of enabling Mexico to get to energy sovereignty. All of those were hit by just an avalanche of amparos, one after the other after the other. The amparos didn't succeed in stopping the projects, but it required the government to spend an inordinate amount of time and resources to fight off one after the other after the other. And they would also very cleverly, you have all these right-wing interests using specious, sometimes environmental arguments or arguments like that to kind of greenwash or to try to cover up who was really behind or who was really advising these lawsuits or these amparo suits, right? The problem with the amparo is when the amparo is granted, the project is stopped. So it's stopped. It's stopped like that.
Right.
So that was the idea. Gum everything up, stop everything. Right.
Right. So
And then you
similar
would
to
get
how our injunction works, where, when there's a stay, it's like, okay, nobody move
nobody
until this is
moves. Exactly.
right. Right.
And then in certain cases, for example, when AMLO passed the electric reform to bring the electrical grid back under public control, not totally, but more of it, the judge in that case passed an amparo, granted an amparo to a company, and then made it generalized it to any other potential case, essentially turning the amparo into a quasi-veto power. Right?
Right.
Because it wasn't just
Yeah.
for that case. It was like a general stay, right?
Right.
That wasn't the original idea of the amparo. The original idea of the amparo is that you are facing an abuse and the amparo is for you, not that it can be used to invalidate a law. But that's what it's happened. And also another problem with the amparo is it became very elastic, the question of who had standing, what we call standing, to
Right.
apply for an amparo in the first place. So in the case of the airport, the AIFA, you would have notable right-wing figures like Claudio X Gonzalez, who gets funding from USAID, and that was a whole different story, putting in the amparo because the argument was the airport affected their constitutional rights.
Right.
It's like,
That's
it's like
that's what
you
I was
have to
trying to say.
prove that the original idea of the amparo is very much like standing. You have to prove that there's an affectation against you, not just that you don't like something. That's not enough. But that's how elastic the thing became, right?
Right.
So it could
And
be used
is
for
it was it
anything.
for individuals only, or what, like in the original understanding of it? Was it supposed to be protecting like individual citizens? Was it ever meant to be for like corporations? Like what was
The
the
original idea was individuals, but the amparo has a very important use for legitimate environmental groups or social groups or whatever else who can make a collective case, neighborhood groups, activist groups. That's the good use of the amparo. That a certain measure is affecting their community, is affecting their neighborhood, is affecting their local collective rights. That's good. That's what we want,
right?
right?
Yeah. So
What
it's
we
like
don't want
when
are
our
these.
ACLU brings a suit,
Yes.
right? Like it's like doing that. Okay. Sorry.
So instead, you had these specious amparos where you had, people saying, "Well, the airport affects my rights, or the new refinery, or this or that." So, this was part and parcel of the public anger that led to the judicial reform. This abuse of the amparo, because another abuse of the amparo was by very wealthy people here to use it against tax cases. It became very used to postpone eternally back tax bills, big back tax bills. So you have somebody now like Ricardo Salinas Pliego, one of the wealthiest people in Mexico, who's the owner of the TV Azteca television station. His company Electra owes somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion in back taxes. And they've been using an eternal battery of legal firms and amparos to postpone these judgments for decades. And Salinas Pliego's cases, those cases date back to at least 2008. 2008, the oldest ones. We're in 2025 now, almost 2026. It becomes an eternal thing because you place an amparo that has to go through all the pipeline. Then you can place an amparo against, the judgment, and then you appeal that, and then you just, rinse and repeat. Because the Mexican Constitution is a very long constitution. It's got a lot of clauses. It's much longer than the U.S. Constitution. So you can always find something in there to say, this affects my constitutional rights, amparo. The amount they're trying to bill me is excessive. That affects my constitutional rights. Amparo. Amparo, amparo, amparo. And then it goes on and on and on and on. So a big push by the López Obrador government and the Sheinbaum government is to collect the back taxes of these people. They simply have to cough up. They have to pay. And that is part of the impetus that led to the judicial reform. Very interestingly, just this week, a few blocks from here, I think 7 of the 9 cases against Salinas Pliego are probably going to be voted on this week with the new Supreme Court, which is much less likely to view favorably the eternal postponement of taxes via the figure of the amparo. And we're probably going to have somebody very interesting on, I can't yet say who, on Soberanía to talk about it next week.
Oh my God, I can't wait. I am so excited. I know that this has been like, because explain to me y'all's court like term system. Like when I know they were like seated, well, they were elected in June. But when are they seated? What are the terms like? Because like here they just started their term October 1. So what is the Mexican Supreme Court like?
The new court was seated in September, and they are term limited to 12-year terms. Yeah, 12-year terms.
Mhm.
Right. So that's 12 and out.
And what is their season? Like, do they, so
It's similar to the
February.
U.S. season in that
Okay,
sense. Yeah,
gotcha. So they take the summer off basically, and like,
pretty
okay,
much.
so they
Yeah.
just started.
Mhm.
Awesome. I am like, I've been like, okay, I'm waiting for like the first, things to come out. Again, what I'm really waiting for is all of the rampant corruption that's supposed to come out of this newly elected Supreme Court based on the, um,
Yeah, and there's a
on the
lot
right
that
wing.
may come out, and there may be a lot of pushback against it. So you have to be very careful.
A lot of 15 years, one term.
What's that?
15 years,
One term, 15 years.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of, it's going to rattle a lot of interest that was used to having the Mexican judicial system in their back pocket.
Right.
And now they
Yeah.
don't. And that is going to lead to, any kind of potentially dangerous maneuvering or pushback or
Right.
trying to heat up the streets or,
Right. Lots of rending of garments, for the fact that we have to pay our millions of dollars in taxes.
pay their taxes. Yeah. So
Right. Yeah.
so they just actually passed, just to close that out, they passed an amparo reform law. It was just passed. And it's got several points, but the main one is restricting who has what's called the legitimate interest or standing. So you
Mhm.
can't just put an abstract amparo against anything. And it also puts a restriction in against what would happen is the Financial Intelligence Unit, which is in the executive, would freeze an account of someone who's accused of corruption, right? That person would put in an amparo. The amparo would be granted. The account would be unfrozen. They'd empty the account. And so even if there was an unfavorable judgment down the road, it didn't matter. They already emptied the account. That money was gone. So the idea now is to also restrict the use of the amparo to unfreeze accounts while the process is going on, while the process is, going through. Right? So that was this, and that was why it was so, that was why it was such a hue and cry from right wing voices, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I remember in particular, again, when I was getting crucified for saying, "Oh, this judicial reform is super cool." One of the things that was brought up over and over again was the Mayan train, and I need to watch Bell's interview on your other show about it.
Very interesting.
But yeah, I'm excited to get into it. I've been in shutdown mode, but the Mayan train and all the environmental things. Like, you don't understand all the, like, all of the judicial actions that had to be taken against this and whatnot. And I remember rolling my eyes and being like, I'm sure there's more to this story. Again, the more I've listened to you guys, the more I've been like, yeah, there's a lot more to this story than that. Um,
Can I
but
jump in and
you
do a
know,
plug for that? That interview is fantastic. Etienne von Bentrap, he's a researcher at University College London, but he's Mexican despite his name. And he has done an incredible amount of on the ground work. So all of these kinds of questions he's posed to the community. And there's some really interesting insights from that experience that he shares with us in that interview. But just to share one, for example, that I think really kind of speaks to how wrong this has been depicted, which is he was talking about this one community, which as a result of kind of the environmental assessment, figured out that they would probably need a gas station in that community in order to serve, the different infrastructure that was going to now be brought in as a result of this big train project. And, Etienne told us a story. The easiest thing would have been just give a concession to one of the major gas stations here, right? We have this state-owned one, Pemex, but there's also kind of, what is it, BP and all these other ones that came in as a result of an energy reform in the neoliberal period. Obviously, that would have been like, okay, here you go. And you know what they did instead? They created a cooperative. They took that cooperative to visit other communities that had similarly engaged in these kinds of service projects or infrastructure things, that had built their own gas station in their community. And then so that they would organize it as a cooperative and then share the profits of that business with that community, right? And so it shows that there was a very determined effort to attend to the demands of the population. There's a lot of concerns around water, and Etienne says it. He's like, of course, right? These communities go through very long periods of drought, sometimes 9 months, 11 months. And so they were scared, legitimately so, that this would mean. And so there was all kinds of efforts to be made in terms of what kind of water infrastructure they would build so that they would actually solve the problem of water instead of making it worse by bringing in, a new hotel project or something like that.
right.
So all of this stuff actually did, but none of that was talked about, right? None of the actual
No.
efforts to attend to the community demands. For example, in the city of Merida, which is a very popular tourist destination as well, is part of this. But they wanted to build the train so that it would arrive into the center of Merida, the city. But it would have involved destroying too many communities and affecting the livelihoods of too many people. So they listened to the demands and they built it outside the city, and then they built kind of like a busway to transport people from the station to the downtown Merida. Just it shows that there was actually a real commitment to solving these problems so that so you could get that community buy-in that didn't actually happen. For example, all of these environmentalists that kind of talk about, oh, they're drawing a scar across the forest. And obviously it is kind of worrisome when you see the images of, forest on one side, train tracks, and forest on the other side. But, where was this effort to attend to community demands and needs when they built those highways that crisscross that same area, right? When they built that massive Cancun airport, which is
Right.
amongst the biggest in all of Latin America. It's one of the busiest, the third busiest, I think, something like that.
Mhm.
In Mexico, the busiest is obviously Mexico City. So all of these projects that were, or the mining that happens in this, right?
Right.
This project was very much about responding to the fact that these are underinvested communities, and they have been for decades. And the only thing that had been offered were low-wage tourism jobs. And this was about thinking about something differently, about trying to bring some of that same tourism revenue into other parts that obviously would never see it, and also breaking the monopoly that the bus companies have in this region. They charge you an excessive amount to drive what is essentially a half hour from the airport into Cancun. Anybody who's ever or has had to pay exorbitant fees for a taxi to take you to your airport, it's because they have a monopoly. And all of this is about trying to solve these problems that have been existing for a really long time.
Yeah. No, I mean, infrastructure investment is always tricky because you are likely going to disturb something environmentally. You are going to, mess with the footprint of the existing community. And but as you said, like all the difference in the world is that the community get a huge say in how that happens to them because they might be like, we're all for the investment, but please don't just like bulldoze through us and whatnot, which
Mhm.
is totally reasonable. And we have plenty of examples, stateside of, investments that went really well because there was community buy-in, exactly what you're describing, and then ones that were just awful. Our highway system, people are always like, Eisenhower, the highway system. And I'm like, yeah, destroyed every black community it could possibly find, like that is the legacy of our freeways.
Right.
Did
Going
we
right
did
through
we ever
cities, redlining, that whole history. Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and just destroying. I mean, like, and of course, economically destroying those communities because it literally bulldozed entire, Black communities to the ground. And then again, we're like, speaking of creating problems and then bitching about the solutions. It's like, oh, like we have a housing crisis and now people are like, kind of like tenementing, and it's like, yeah, well, I don't know, maybe they all had houses just a few years ago before we threw a highway through them. Anyway, um without pontificating, Jose Luis and Kurt, I would love your final thoughts as we wrap up here. We our first episode was about like myth busting and about kind of getting to, you did a great job of being like Mexico in a nutshell, but getting to a lot of great detail as well. And today we got to do a little more um very specific targeted examples of not just Mexico but Venezuela, talking about Latin America in general. In the current state of things where um, we have a Congress that has refused to curb our president on his military actions so far, in general, has not curbed them when he bombed Iran earlier this year, has not curbed them in Latin America, is being, and quite frankly, even if he had gone through the whole ritual of going to them for permission, they probably would have given it to him because, anyway, of all the things that we were
Yeah.
talking about
They're
earlier.
saying basically, just
Uh,
cut us in. Just cut us in.
right, just kind of right, just please, like,
Yeah.
just so eye roll worthy. But um, I would love, like, obviously, again, my following is mostly stateside, though I have, others as well. I would just love for you to speak to the people who will either watch this later or I'll clip this on the social media as always. Speak to the people about like what do we as the people on the ground, because what last Tuesday's election showed us is that the people on the ground of the US are ready to do what we need to do to take this country where it needs to go. It's not perfect. It's not where it needs to be yet, but I think our citizenry is very much galvanized in spite of our Senate Democrats doing everything they can to pour cold water on that. I would love to hear from you guys. What is it that we, the people, should be doing stateside to address these, our own, like, to address the relationship with Latin America, to address the very real dangers that this puts us all in. It puts our armed forces in harm's way for no reason. It does all sorts of things. So, like, if you could like talk directly into the living rooms of people who will see this later, like, and those who are watching now, what do you want to say to us, the U.S. citizens on the ground?
I think I'll start talking about Mamdani because I think he's a really interesting political phenomenon for the United States. And I think there's a lot of Latin American politics in his way of doing politics that I think can be really instructive. I think there's a lot of really kind of efforts to try to cast him with the same kind of analysis that has not really served the US public generally. I was listening to the podcast from the New York Times, The Daily, around this, and I forget the name of the reporter they were interviewing, but he was mentioning how, in some ways, Mamdani is kind of the litmus test for where people fall on the spectrum. The centrist Democrats will be like, well, he was really disciplined in his message, really emphasizing affordability, and wow, is he a good communicator and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's true, but that's not why he went from nobody to mayor of one of the most important cities in the world. It happened because, one, I think, obviously, yes, he's a very good communicator. He's very charismatic, but there is substance behind it. You've seen all these copycats, all these centrists who are trying to do videos on the subway and the same kind of thing. And it just doesn't read the same way. And I think above all, young people can always see through the bullshit. And it's because he stood for something. He represented something, right? It was clearly there was conviction behind what he was promising. And he wasn't just promising band-aids or patchwork solutions, but big picture things. Like, for example, here in Mexico, it was always a question of, what are we going to do to transform this country? Because the status quo is unacceptable, right? That same kind of anti-established animus that does exist throughout the United States, and I think that Trump successfully tapped into, that existed here. And it wasn't Lopez Obrador promising that things were going to get a little bit better, but quite literally promising a fourth transformation of this country, saying that this is on the level of our fight for independence, of our fight for a liberal institution, of our fight in the Mexican Revolution, right? Like these are really big picture kind of use your imagination kind of thinking. I think that's something that Mamdani did. And the other thing I would say is the mass politics. Absolutely. Go and vote if you feel like the candidate speaks to you and you're compelled to do that, or you view it as a strategic to kind of isolate some of the worst of elected politicians. That's up for people to decide individually. But would encourage people to think about mass politics, which I think, again, Mamdani represented. He was always on the streets with the people or holding mass rallies, or even his closings or his victory speech, which was criticized by people like Van Jones, for example, right? His victory speech was very much speaking to that base of saying, you need to do this too. You have to be mobilized. Things are going to change when we do this together. Even Bernie did some of that, right? Not me, us, all that kind of stuff. Our revolution of always understanding that there has to be not just a place, but a central role for mass politics so that people feel that they can engage in kind of these bold prescriptions, these bold solutions, and also to push the centrists. For example, there was this demo where Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York State, was like, well, I don't know if I'm going to provide the funding for daycare and the free buses and all of that. And what did the crowd say? Tax the rich, right? Spontaneously. And she pushed back on it. But
I
that she's going to be worried about her response. Her team afterwards was like, we have to workshop something there because your answer was terrible. And all you're going to do is
it
turn
was.
the Democrats against us.
The more you
It
push
was
them, the less likely
embarrassing.
they win.
Which was so dumb.
Oh,
It
when
was
she said
terrible.
that, I was like, "Girl, I'm so embarrassed for you." Also, at least Stefanik is coming to run against you, so you need to watch yourself right
Right?
now,
Yeah.
Yeah.
like, because
And that,
she's popular. Like
that's them
that's
scaring them. Yeah. And that if you're going to play that game and you're going to give bullshit responses, then you're going to get primaried and you're going to get kicked out. And you're going to push for somebody who will tax the rich. Because why not? This is what we're talking about. And it's essentially, again, and to tie it to, we're not going to just tax the rich as an abstract. We're not just going to write them on a dress for some gala the way that, AOC did at one point, but actually be like, so that we can deliver healthcare, so that we can deliver daycare, so we can deliver, in the case of New York, these publicly owned grocery stores. All of this kind of stuff I think is really important. It's one of the things that have been always missing from the conversation, but has always been central to the conversation here in Latin America. It's never been kind of like the focus groups, all these kind of tested ideas of actually going and doing the work of, as we say in journalism, the shoe leather work of going out there and talking to people and convincing them and creating infrastructure so that you can pull them in and keep them mobilized, not demobilize them the way that Obama did.
And it's funny that you were talking before about some of the voices that maybe kind of making fun of this idea of Venezuela, of pooling medicines and deciding who gets, what in what case. You know, wait in a couple of weeks when people's ACA subsidies run out and the premiums go up double and triple. You're going to watch people doing that.
Yeah.
That's the U.S. is very close to that.
Yep.
Actually.
No, I completely agree. Like I'm so horrified already by just the sight of it, and it's something I've been reporting on like since the Big Beautiful Bill. So I'm like, we've been staring down the barrel of this all year, and it's finally come home to everybody. They're like, we are in shit in 2026, and I was like, yeah, we are. We are. It's about to get real bad. So I agree. People are gonna be like, rationing insulin and whatever. It's not gonna be good.
And just to follow up on, kind of speaking directly to the U.S. public, what I would add to what Jose Luis said is something very simple, and it's don't throw Latin America under the bus, right? Because I think that's the sense sometimes from voices from Latin America that it's very easy to throw Latin America under the bus when, it comes to prioritizing, domestic issues or even, Mamdani said something very unfortunate about Venezuela. And it's not just saying it, it's saying it right at the time when the Trump administration is actively talking about invading Venezuela. So it's like, don't help that. At the very least, just don't say anything, but don't help that along. Don't give that cover from the left. Don't give that cover from progressive voices, right? It's like, the shutdown. It's like, don't own Trump's shutdown. Don't own Trump's foreign policy either. And don't throw Latin America under the bus, right? I think that's really important. This idea of mass politics, we talked about in the last time we were on your show that when Trump was threatening Mexico with tariffs, one of the 4 times, Claudia Sheinbaum called a mass rally here in the Zocalo. very last minute. And then they came to an agreement to postpone tariffs. So people thought, oh, well, that kind of lets the air out of this rally. 350,000 people showed up anyway. They showed up anyway. They marched right down Isabella Católica here. They filled the Zocalo to bursting, all, the surrounding streets, not just with people, but with bands and with people on stilts and with jugglers and with, it's like a festival atmosphere. Mass politics can be engaging, and mass politics can be fun,
Yeah.
right? But it requires mass politics,
Right.
okay? Because they're never, ever, ever going to do it on their own, right? And there's a long tradition in the United States of progressive politics being internationalist, right? I remember when I was a kid, there was massive movements against what Reagan was doing in Central America, right? Didn't stop Reagan, but those movements were there, and the idea of just focusing on our own stuff, we have to have a broader picture. We have a broader picture, right? Because we can't allow a situation where the global South gets trod on so they can give us crumbs of a welfare state in the global North that they can then just retract. They just retract because one thing depends on the other. And that's the case where I have to make one thing depends on the other. So we have to always be, have the broadest view possible in that. And, and say, not in our name.
Right.
Not in our name, because if they had their druthers, they would bomb Mexico if they thought they could get away with it tomorrow. Because Trump wanted to do that, as Mike Esper said in his memoir. Trump was saying, let's just lob some Patriot missiles into Mexico and say somebody else did it. If they thought they could get away with it, they would. And one of the things that has stopped and prevented an invasion of Venezuela right now is that the American public doesn't support it.
Right.
You have an enormous voice in the United States. You have an enormous voice in the United States to oppose that. And that does matter. It seems like it doesn't, but it does. Why has the Trump administration pulled back from the brink in Venezuela? Because of mobilization in Venezuela, but also because the American public doesn't support it. So there is that. It's very important. That's what I would say from here.
Yeah, no, that's a point that I try to make all the time is like, if you think that they can't hear you, like you're wrong. If you think that they didn't notice the No Kings protest, if you think they didn't, they obviously derided it, right? They're going to make fun of it. They're going to say, oh, whatever. But at the end of the day, every time he gets pushback, he does retreat. Maybe not all the way, and maybe still find some other bullshit end around or something. But he'll get real quiet, when it's like, no, we're not doing that. Even with this whole like SNAP thing this past week, saying that they weren't going to use the contingency fund, and then a judge was like, you're going to use the contingency fund, and they were like, okay, we're going to use the contingency fund. It's just not. It doesn't. It really is just him like a small child, seeing what they can do, and as soon as you say no, it's like, okay, well, he's eventually going to pick his battles. He can't do everything all at once. Um, and then of course, it's been a chaotic couple of days now. But Jose Luis and Kurt, I just want to say like how much I appreciate y'all's voices in this space, especially providing these resources to English speaking audiences. Because unfortunately, we are not in a country that makes us multilingual very easily. I wish we were. I'm always very jealous of like every other nation in this world, because I'm like, look how amazing this is. This is probably why they cooperate so much better, because we communicate. But things being what they are, I really can't tell you, just on a personal level, like how much I've appreciated, having the podcast, and then also the other media resources that you guys have, where at the very least you can have like the captions and whatnot. And it's so helpful in this moment where it would be too easy, as you said, to like throw Latin America under the bus, or at the, if nothing else, to just try to forget about it, right? It's like we got so much stuff to do here at the home front, like we can't think about this. And your efforts really make it so that like we can think about it, right? Every week I can sit down and be like, all right, what are we doing, on this? Or what are the blind spots? Because it's all stuff like our media is not going to report on. It's all things that, or if they report on it, it's going to be very interesting. Like the Nobel Peace Prize, for instance, they're going to have their take. And I really, really cannot say enough about this resource. So for those who are listening now or in the future when I post this, if you are not tuned in to the Soberanía podcast, if you are not tuned into Mexico Solidarity Media, you are missing out, and you have no excuses for not being up on what's going on in Latin America because it's in English. Like you can keep up with it. Are there any plugs or announcements you want to make? I know you have a new talk about your new show real quick because you've got a new and it's on YouTube, I know. But like if you want to talk about what you're doing over there, 'cause it's super cool, super fun.
So the new show is called El Taller, which means the workshop, and it takes place in an actual bookbinding workshop. And the metaphor is real. The idea is to workshop ideas, analysis related to Mexico's transformation, Mexico's place in the world, Latin America in general. We hit geopolitical stuff. We've had a very interesting roster of guests so far. We've got that special person coming up next week. And the idea is to do in the workshop what we can't do in Soberanía. Soberanía is we've got an hour, we hit 3 topics and do our media critique at the end. In the workshop, we can let rip with a long form interview, really go down the rabbit holes, go, where we want to go and really have those kind of really meaty conversations. So we're enjoying it. We're enjoying it so far. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much again for taking the time to speak to all of this. As the after the first boat bombing in the Caribbean, I was like, I really hope this is a one-off, but I'm afraid it's not. And as soon as it was clear that it was not a one-off, I was like, I need to bring them back. I need, I want to make sure that I, at least on my platform, which is not very big, but for what it's worth, like, am refusing to ignore and or throw it under the bus, as you said. I want to make sure that it is,
Yes. Thank you so much for
central
that.
to the messaging. Absolutely. And now it's funny. Now my husband is trained to send me all of Claudia Scheinbaum's social media posts now. So it's really funny. Like I end up reposting everything, but he's like, "Did you see this one? Did you see this one?" When she did her, what is it called on your Independence Day? Uh,
Grito de la Independencia.
the great, yes, the great when she did the grito. My husband sent that to me, and he was like, "I am getting chills right now from this woman." I was like, "Yeah, she's a queen, like not in a literal queen, but like I would be okay with that." No, yeah, I'm huge fan all the time. And then I noticed like the all female guard and everything with her, and I was just like, this is boss level, like great stuff right now. If only we had such a leader. Anyway, thank you both so much for your time as always, and your knowledge, and your very like fair balanced takes on everything. It's a breath of fresh air in these times, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Kate. You too. Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.